Before the headline, before the arrest, before the body. Cycles that kill. On May 29, 2019, Devon Kareem Robinson left a party on Detroit's East Side and walked to the BP gas station where he had met his eventual victims a few hours earlier. Surveillance footage captured what happened next. He stood at the gas station dry heaving, spitting, his body doing something his conscious mind did not decide to do. Dry heaving is an involuntary physiological response, the nervous system processing something it cannot metabolize through ordinary means. You don't choose to dry heave, it happens to you. Which means that what that surveillance camera captured was not a man planning a crime. It was a man whose body was in crisis over something his identity could not hold. Within an hour, he had on a ski mask, a gun in hand, and 3 people were dead. Welcome to Cycles That Kill. I'm Dr. Dylesia, and today we are not just going to talk about what Devon did. We're going to talk about what happened inside of him, between the gas station and the crime scene. Because that distance between a body in crisis and a body committing triple homicide has a name, and it has a history that started somewhere earlier, in a home with a mother, with everything that home taught him and everything it failed to teach him, about what you do when who you are becomes a threat to who you need to be seen as. Alante Davis was 21 years old. Timothy Blanchard was 20 years old. Paris Cameron was 20 years old and a transgender woman. She was the 7th transgender person killed in the United States in 2019. They met Devon at a gas station on the way to a party. Paris invited him. They didn't know him, but extended him hospitality. They let him into a space where they felt safe. Later, they will be shot by him in the living room of their friend's Detroit home. So many bullets were fired that their blood seeped through the walls. Alante, Timothy, Paris. This episode is ultimately for them. Not for Devon, for them. Over the 2019 Memorial Day weekend, a party was held at a home on Devonshire Street on Detroit's East Side. About 15 people attended. At around 2:30 a.m., a group from the party walked to a nearby BP gas station, the same one Devon would later dry heave at. He was already there. Paris, who did not know Devon, approached him and invited him to the party. He went. At the party, witnesses described Devon as being hugged up with Paris. At some point during the party, Devon received oral sex from multiple people, and guests began calling it an orgy and joking about his sexuality, saying they would see him again. Devon left the party. Witnesses noted his demeanor was off, blank. He walked back to the BP gas station. At 4:03 in the morning, Devon returned to his home on Buckingham Avenue. Less than an hour later, surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera shows a figure dressed in all black, walking from the direction of Devon's house toward Devonshire Street. A masked person arrived at the party and opened fire. Alante was struck twice. Timothy and Paris were each hit 4 times. 2 other people in the house were shot and survived. Devon's intent was not to kill 3 specific people. The prosecution established that he came back to eliminate every witness in that room, every person who had seen what happened at that party. When the shooting started, Alante and Paris ran toward the kitchen. Timothy and a friend named Armand Matthews fled to the basement. Clifton Keys, a friend of the victims who had been at the party, sat in shock for 3 seconds when the masked figure walked in before the gunfire erupted. Clifton and Armand would later emerge as survivors, but they survived not because Devon chose to spare them, rather because chaos moved them out of the direct line of fire. After the massacre, Devon fled. He and his mother, Mallory Robinson, left their home on Buckingham Avenue shortly after the crime. Prosecutors later accused her of helping hide him. He was found several days later after an anonymous tip and was arrested. At trial, the prosecutor said in closing arguments, "This is a case about hate. This is a case about self-hate." Devon was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole at 19 years old. Here is the clinical paradox at the center of this case, and I want to sit with it because it's the question that makes this episode worth doing. Devon's mother, Mallory, stated on a prison call with Devon that she and his sister are lesbians, which means he grew up in a household where homosexuality was not foreign, not shameful, not something that was explicitly condemned. And yet, he stood at a gas station dry heaving over a same-sex sexual experience. He went home, got a weapon, and killed 3 people to eliminate the witnesses to it because he was terrified people would find out. How do you reconcile those two things? Family members who are gay and a man who cannot survive being seen as anything other than straight. How does that happen? The clinical concept I want to introduce here is ecological incongruence, and I want to define it precisely because it's the key that unlocks everything else in this episode. Ecological incongruence is what happens when the values and messages of the home environment conflict with the values and messages of the broader community, and a child, obviously spends most of their time in that broader community. When those environments conflict around something as identity-defining as sexuality and masculinity, the community often wins. Not because it's right, but because community is where social survival happens, whereas home is just where you sleep. Devon was a young Black man on Detroit's East Side. He was navigating a peer culture with rigid and unforgiving rules about masculine identity, where being perceived as gay has social consequences that can be physical, immediate, and lasting, where what you do sexually is tied directly to your standing among other men, where the masculine curriculum says if you are anything other than straight, you can't be that. His home said one thing, the world said another, and the world was louder, more constant, more socially enforced, more dangerous to contradict. So it seems like Devon grew up holding 2 completely incompatible curricula simultaneously. The home where his mother and sister's identities existed, and the world outside where that same identity applied to him as a young man felt like a death sentence. I want to go back to the gas station because that moment before the ski mask, before the gun, before anything was decided is the most clinically revealing moment in this entire case. Devon left that party and walked to the BP gas station, and his body started rejecting something. He entered a somatic crisis. His nervous system was doing what nervous systems do when they encounter something they cannot integrate. They refuse it physically, before language, before thought, before decision. What his body was averse to was the experience he had just had, and the exposure of that experience to witnesses, and what that exposure meant for who he understood himself to be. This is internalized homophobia, which is not the same thing as believing homosexuality is wrong. It is the experience of shame, self-loathing, and terror that develops specifically around one's own same-sex desire, not as a conscious ideological position, but as an absorbed emotional response to the messages the surrounding culture has been sending you about being gay. You can grow up in a home where homosexuality is present and accepted, and simultaneously absorb from the peer culture, the neighborhood, the masculine scripts of the world around you, a deep and visceral sense that same-sex desire in you specifically is catastrophic, something that if known will cost you something you cannot afford to lose. That absorbed message does not live in the conscious mind, it lives in the body, which is why Devon's body responded at the gas station before his mind had made any decision. His internalized homophobia activated somatically, in the dry heaving, in the spitting, in the physical rejection of the oral sex orgy he just participated in. And then his mind caught up, and it made a decision that his body in crisis had already been preparing for. So Devon went home, put on a ski mask, got a handgun, dressed in all Black clothing, and he walked back to the house party. The prosecution classified this as a hate crime motivated by the victim's sexual orientation and gender identity. And legally, that framing is accurate. Devon Robinson targeted people because of who they were. But the clinical picture is more specific than that and more disturbing, because Devon did not return to that house because he hated gay people. He returned because the people in that house were witnesses to something about him that he didn't want to get out. That is not hate crime psychology. That is masculinity threat response. Masculinity threat response is what happens when a man whose sense of masculine identity is fragile, whose self-concept is organized around a rigid definition of what it means to be a man, when that person experiences something that contradicts that definition. The response is not embarrassment, it's not regret, it's existential threat. The masculine identity does not feel bruised, it feels annihilated, and the response to annihilation is not grief, it is self-defense. What Devon experienced at that party was not just a sexual encounter he regretted. It was the demolition of an identity he'd been constructing and maintaining in the world outside of his mother's home. Masculinity threat response does not always produce violence. Most of the time, it produces avoidance, denial, aggressive overcompensation. The man who becomes loudly and conspicuously hypermasculine after a moment of perceived emasculation. But in a person who has no other framework for managing existential threat, whose conflict resolution toolkit contains nothing between avoidance and violence, the response can go exactly where Devon's went. And here's where the home becomes clinically relevant again, because you don't arrive at 19 years old with nothing between avoidance and violence without having learned somewhere that those are the only two options. That teaching happens in childhood, in the home, and what is modeled about how people handle moments when they feel their identity is under threat. Devon arrived at the house on Devonshire Street and opened fire in the living room. He shot until there were so many bullets that the house was bleeding. The prosecutor named it precisely self-hate. And I want to build on that framing clinically because I think it is exactly right but lacks full context. What Devon committed that night was a shame-based crime, and shame-based violence is a specific and documented psychological phenomenon that is distinct from hatred, from rage, and from premeditated malice in the traditional sense. Shame-based violence is what happens when disgrace and regret, specifically the anticipation of being exposed and losing something essential about how you are seen, activates a fight response rather than a flight or freeze response. The violence is not an expression of power, it's an act of self-preservation. The self being preserved is not the physical body, it's the identity, the image, in this case, the version of himself that Devon had been presenting to the world. And this is where I want to hold up the mirror, as I always do, because shame-based violence is the most extreme end of a spectrum that most people exist somewhere on. The man who lashes out at his partner after she discovers something he didn't want her to know. The woman who cuts off a friend who saw her at her worst. The person who burns a relationship to the ground rather than sit with being known imperfectly. None of those are triple homicide, but all of them are shame-activating a response whose primary goal is to eliminate the witness, to remove the person who saw what you cannot allow to be seen. Devon did not return to that house to kill gay people. He returned to kill everyone who knew. Every single person in that room was a target. The prosecution established he intended to murder all of them. 3 people died, 2 survived because they moved fast enough. The motive was not identity, the motive was knowledge. They knew something about him that he could not fathom being known. The shooting was not an act of rage. Rage has a face. Rage is activated and present and visible. But what witnesses described Devon walked out of that party as was blank. Nothing. An absence of expression in the moments where maximum violence was cooking. That's not an absence of feeling, though. That is what dissociation, which is what the nervous system does when the emotional experience becomes too overwhelming to remain fully present in, looks like from the outside. The conscious mind partially exits the present because the present exceeds what the conscious mind can hold, which means Devon may not have been fully there during the shooting in the way we assume. His body was in that room, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. That tells us the shooting was not an act of rage, rather something colder and more distant than rage. This was a nervous system executing a survival response. Shame had overcome Devon with such force that by the time he returned to eliminate the witnesses, his system had already shut down the part that would have registered what he was actually doing. I want to turn the lens to Devon's mom, Mallory, now. So let's rattle off some facts. Mallory disclosed her own sexuality on a recorded prison call with Devon after his conviction. She raised Devon on Detroit's east side, and after Devon committed triple homicide, the prosecution accused her of helping him flee. She left their home shortly after the massacre along with him. Devon was found days later because of an anonymous tip. The last part is the documented maternal angle I want to start with, because it is a pattern that has come up this season. A mother whose first response to her child committing an act of catastrophic violence is not accountability. It's protection, cover, management of the exposure. Now here's what I want to origin map, not accusatorily, but honestly. Prosecutors established that Devon was terrified his family would find out about the same-sex encounter that he'd had at that party. So terrified that he killed 3 people to prevent it. Now think about that terror in the context of what we know about Mallory. She's a lesbian, raising a son in a community with a very specific and very unforgiving curriculum about masculinity and sexuality, which means Mallory herself has been navigating a tension that Devon was also being asked to navigate. The tension between who you are and what the community around you will accept you being. We don't know how Mallory navigated that tension. We don't know if she was out loudly, quietly, or somewhere in between. We don't know what Devon saw when he watched his mother move through a community that had opinions about who she was. But here's what origin mapping tells us about the space between a mother and a child when both of them are navigating the same community pressure around identity. The mother is either the antidote or the confirmation. Either she gives the child what the community is taking away, so language, safety, the lived proof that you can be fully known and survive it. or she inadvertently confirms through her own navigation that some parts of who you are require careful management, concealment, protection from the outside world. I'm not saying Mallory told Devon to be ashamed. I'm not saying her sexuality caused his. What I am saying is that Devon arrived at 19 years old with no tools to hold his own identity against that community pressure, and the person most positioned to give him those tools, because she was living the same tension in the same neighborhood, apparently may not have. Either because she had not resolved it in herself, and/or because the community was simply that loud, and/or because nobody had ever given her those tools either. And then there's the second failure, the one that is less about identity and more about conflict. Devon had no landing pad between avoidance and violence. Whatever he felt at that gas station, however real and overwhelming the shame and the terror were, the only response his system could generate was elimination. Get rid of the witnesses, make it so nobody knows. That is a conflict resolution failure. And conflict resolution, or the absence of it, is almost always a home failure first. Children learn what to do with overwhelming emotion by watching the adults around them. What did Mallory model about what you do when someone threatens to expose you? What did she demonstrate about sitting with shame rather than acting on it? What did she show Devon about the difference between a feeling that is unbearable and an action that is irreversible? We don't know. We don't have that documented record, but we know the outcome. And the outcome tells us that whatever was modeled, or whatever was absent from what was modeled, left Devon with a toolkit that contained exactly one response to existential threat. And then after he used it, she helped him hide. That is loyalty conditioning. That is the same pattern we heard about in this season between Dylesia Anderson and her son, who were victims in Tony Carruthers' alleged triple murder live burial case. A mother who absorbs, who covers, who manages the exposure rather than confronting the behavior, who in the most critical moment chooses protection over accountability. So let's pull it all together. Ecological incongruence, the experience of holding two completely incompatible messages about who you are, one from home and one from the world. Do you know what that feels like? To be one person in your house and a different person the moment you walk out the door? To carry an identity that home accepts but the world outside is not safe to know about? Or vice versa. Maybe home is or was a war zone and you found safety to live in your truth outside of family. That tension, that exhausting, constant, unresolved tension is not unique to Devon. Internalized homophobia. For those of you who are queer or who love someone who is, it's documented that the body's rejection of its own desire can be one of the most painful experiences a person can carry. It's not a character flaw, it's a wound that was installed by a world that sent a specific message about what your desire means. Just like Devon. Masculinity threat response. For the men listening, what happens in your body when you feel your masculine identity is under threat? When someone sees you in a moment of vulnerability or contradiction, do you have access to the space between feeling threatened and acting on it? If you don't, where did that space go? And who was supposed to teach you it existed or to hold on to it? Shame-based violence. We've all tried to eliminate a witness at some point, not with a gun, but with a less criminal form of cruelty. Whether it be silence, passive aggression, or burning the relationship to the ground rather than sitting with being known imperfectly. The question is not whether you've done it. The question is whether you know why, and whether you have something else to reach for instead of interpersonal brutality. New episodes of Cycles That Kill drop every week. If this episode hit you somewhere real, share it, leave a review on Apple, and come back next week. I'm Dr. Dylesia. This is Cycles That Kill. See you next time.